I will explore the genre of anti-war film through comparison of Elem Klimov's 1985 film Come and See and Edward Bergers' 2022 film Westen, Nichts, Neues, also known as All Quiet on the Western Front. Francois Truffaut famously refuted the existence of anti-war films, and it is in disagreement with him where this study roots its justification, namely as this comparison demonstrates how both films convey the ability of war to instill irreversible psychological trauma in protest of war and adjacent societal ideals, which is what makes them anti-war films and proves the existence of the genre. While Come and See emerged from a Soviet Union recalibrating its collectivist dogma amidst intense geopolitical Cold War tensions, Westen, Nichts, Neues emerged in a modern-day Germany facing growing societal polarization, a rise in far-right powers, and an active war in Europe not seen since World War II. Come and See focuses on a young boy named Florian Geischen who finds a rifle in the sand and joins the Soviet partisan resistance to Nazi German invasion during World War II. His resolve is rewarded only by war's unyielding carnage. Come and See explores themes of trauma, identity, and the human capacity for violence. Westen, Nichts, Neues centers on Paul Bäumer, a 17-year-old boy who, along with his friends, follows the allure of imperial propaganda and enlists to fight for Germany on the Western Front of World War I, where they realize their worthlessness to the ever-spinning war machine. Westen, Nichts, Neues focus on themes of structural violence, identity, and trauma. Francois Truffaut justified his refutation of the anti-war film genre by claiming that every film which presents war will glorify it in some way, like dehumanizing the enemy, emphasizing glorious victory, or showing a hero's journey. Nonetheless, there are a few films which can be classified as part of the anti-war genre. This genre is not defined by technical or narrative conventions, but by intent, which centers around the exposure of war's uncensored, brutal reality. Both Come and See and Westen, Nichts, Neues adhere to said intent by focusing on the ability of war to instill irreparable psychological trauma. Furthermore, both do so by depicting the transformation of their characters from naively ambitious youth into traumatized shells, specifically through the subconscious level of sound design and manifest visual level through creating a compositional motif. However, where Come and See approaches the installation of trauma on the individual, Westen, Nichts, Neues approaches this topic more broadly, using Paul, a soldier, to represent all in the war machine and how trauma is instilled onto them, approaches indicative of each film's cultural context. Both films use sound design to subconsciously demonstrate the transformation of characters into psychologically traumatized shells and warn against escalating conflict of their time. Where Klimov does so through focusing on the individual, aligning with shifting Soviet rhetoric, Berger focuses on war's traumatization of the collective to warn a polarized Germany to remember its past. Klimov's approach is seen in the use and creation of Floria's subjective oral perspective, where the sound the audience perceives are not representative of reality, but of what Floria chooses to focus on, allowing for demonstration of how Floria's mind and focus is slowly infiltrated by the sounds of war, representing his trauma. Comparatively, Berger's approach is not focused on the manipulation of diegetic sound, rather it is through calculated use of the track entitled Remains, composed by Volker Bertelmann in the film's score. Floria's transformation begins in the establishment of his character before being exposed to war, where as he waits to depart, pecking birds in another room are heard with unnatural clarity. Floria's focus on the birds, symbols of his home, nature, and life, show how he is still full of childish joy and untouched by war. Whereas Berger's transformation begins and remains use as the boys march euphorically towards the Western Front. Here, the track tonally juxtaposes the boys' euphoric song with its harrowing bellow and indicates both their naivety and how the war machine is lulling them to their pointless death through evoking an acute sense of foreboding. Returning to Come and See, where Floria's transformed state is heard while he watches the Nazis exterminate a village as a soundscape of colliding sounds is pierced by a few accentuated tones, the Nazis' bright yodeling and cackling, and the contrasting rough texture of guns and ruling villages, showing how Floria's initial childlike focus on the birds is replaced with the sound of war's evil and their victims, demonstrating how Floria's mind is now filled only with the deafening trauma of war. In contrast, Berger reuses Remains but alters the context in which it is heard to communicate the final stage of Paul's trauma-induced transformation, shown in the track's last use underscoring Paul's group's march into their final senseless and deadly fight with 15 minutes till ceasefire. Since the audience has seen the senseless horror of war throughout the film prior to the scene, the track is no longer foreboding, rather seeming to personify the war machine itself as it asserts its victory over the soldiers and confirms its replacement of naive ambition with the psychological trauma each soldier holds, knowing they are worthless and powerless inside the war machine. Klimov responds to his cultural context, where a focus on the individual as important to the Soviet socialist collective was emerging through his focus on the individual in Floria. This cultural shift is seen in Yuri Andropov's focus on individual responsibility and efficiency, and Tatiana Zaslavskaya's advocacy for individual economic motives. This guided Kamency's overarching intent of warning against the Cold War into exhibiting war's influence on the individual. Comparatively, Bergers' auditory personification of the war machine speaks to the increasingly socially polarized German populace, which under guidance by the far-right AfD party is asked to complete a 180-degree shift in remembrance policy in regard to the Second World War and Nazism, as stated by party member Bjorn Höcke. Given the AfD's ever-growing popularity and the possibility of returning to radical nationalism during the inactive war in Europe, Bergers seeks to warn of the inconsolable psychological trauma which the mechanisms of such ideals perpetrate, by conveying the soullessness at their core through his film's depiction of the war machine, or as he puts it,
"This is what war does. It causes scars for decades, if not centuries, to come."
Now moving to the manifest level visual transformation. Both Kamency and Westen Neues create a recurring compositional motif, the close-up shot of their main character, and use this motif to display how war's psychological trauma causes them to transform from joyful youth into a shell of trauma. The first relevant instance where this compositional motif is used establishes both characters as naively ambitious and youthful prior to their exposure to war. Furthermore, both cinematographer Alexei Rodinov and James Freund use a key light to create a catchlight in the character's eyes, which gives them a signifying glint to establish their ambition. Moreover, this lighting also illuminates the character's smooth skin to convey their youth. However, Klimov and Bergers' differing intents are shown in how the cinematographers establish the character's naivety, where Rodinov uses only the key light in the shot to luminously divide Floria's face while he smiles widely to show how he's naively ignorant of the darkness he's about to venture into, and therefore how his naivety is the flaw of him as an individual. Freund, on the other hand, inverts this approach by flooding Paul's features with light to create high-key lighting, while Paul's expression is resolutely proud and admiring, to symbolize how the propagandizing of their schoolmaster, who embodies the war machine, luminously floods Paul's perception of reality, manipulating him into naivety. Next, this motif's reoccurrence near the end of both films' narratives serves to visually display the complete psychological traumatization of Floria and Paul respectively after their exposure to war, and through visual contrast to the motif's first use. Shown in Kamency's penultimate sequence, where Floria discovers a portrait of Hitler on the ground and fires his gun, for the first time in the film, upon it. Firstly, the makeup department worked on the actor's face to replace his smooth skin with deep wrinkles, crack his lips and dye his hair gray, while Rodinov's low angle evokes shadows to turn his once bright and ambitious eyes into cavities holding despair and hatred, all to show that his youthful attributes from the first close-up have been eradicated. Secondly, during a brief cutaway, Rodinov's camera tilts up into a higher angle, allowing for Floria to explicitly break the fourth wall by looking up into the camera at the viewer, demonstrating Klimov's intent, where Floria as an individual seems to directly plead the audience who came and saw the trauma of war imposed on him, not to let it ever be imposed on anyone again. This directly reflects how Klimov's intent to display the psychological trauma war induces was shaped by the Soviet cultural context of the time, where more and more focus was being given on the individual as the core of the collective. Klimov depicts an individual, specifically a child, to represent the future of the collective, and depicts how this child is victim to complete trauma-induced mental evisceration. Hereby, he places his main intent of warning of the escalation of the Cold War.
Было физическое ощущение, что вот завтра начнется Третья мировая война.
Within the general shifting Soviet rhetoric, by inviting the audience to come and see how war mentally decimates the individual, ultimately alluding that once the submersion core of the collective crumbles, so would it, thereby cementing the film's relevance. Returning now to Westen Neues, where the titular motif reoccurs just before the soldiers' last descent into the West Front with minutes of war remaining, here Freund differentiates the shot from its beginning counterpart through lower key lighting, and in collaboration with colorist Andrew Daniel by replacing the clear light which brought out Paul's youthful features in the beginning with a monotone cool blue to accentuate the makeup department's roughening of Paul's skin and cracking of his lips. Finally, just as in Come and See, the eyes communicate the most drastic change, where once the catchlight had them shine with ambition and pride, the lower key light and blue hue make them seem clouded and emotionless, homogenizing them to his surroundings. This indicates how the war machine has destroyed his individuality and traumatized him so that he accepts his futile and unchangeable place within it, reflecting Bergers' intent, as the war machine has assimilated him through psychological traumatization. However, Bergers' culturally contextual focus is evident in the one further difference between Freund's compositional motifs and Rodinov's. Where Kamency's recurring close-ups frame the character in negative space, Freund's close-up utilize shallow depth depth of field and deep staging to surround Paul with his peers, both as students before or soldiers of the war, showing that although the transformation depicted occurs in Paul, his story is representative of his peers who fell victim to the same propaganda and war machine, leading directly to Berger's cultural context, where producer Malte Grunert asserts in his interview, Edward Berger and I have the impression that lies have become part of political discourse, and there are ultra-right-wing parties in many countries which spread nationalistic lies and propaganda, directly reflecting how the focus on the war machine's radicalization of people is intended as a warning against the machinery of manipulation in the modern far right, both in polarized Germany and beyond. In conclusion, both films protest war and adjacent ideologies of that time by exposing the psychological trauma war enacts, however approach this differently based on their cultural context, firmly cementing them as anti-war films.